Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010, our book, The World of Philosophy, an Introductory Reader by Stephen Kahn. He's the editor who compiled a bunch of philosophical writings. In this video, we are going over the article by Uma Narayana, a professor of philosophy at Vasar College. The article is The Project of Feminist Epistemology. And the question is for Exam 2, Part A, Question 4. What is different about Narayan's position on knowledge from the views of her predecessors? Is her argument convincing? Why or why not? Explain. So her view on knowledge is that, so she's a feminist, and her view on knowledge is that oppressed groups, whether they're women oppressed by predominantly male societies, which is pervasive throughout the whole world, or oppressed groups being men and women of a colonized nation or segment of society, like black people in the United States, or the working class people in England she's talking about the 19th century. Their epistemic advantage, their epistemology is the study of knowledge and how we gain it. The advantage they have is that they can see things through two worldviews, that of the oppressor and that of the oppressed. That is what her idea of knowledge. So we've been studying knowledge epistemology. And so this is, do oppressed people have an advantage? And she's saying, yes, they do. But my point is, she's saying in the article is, don't romanticize that advantage. There's a lot of drawbacks that can come with it. And you have to take this critical stance to understand the advantages and disadvantages of being forced to have these two worldviews, and don't lose sight of gaining equality just because of you've romanticized the benefits of having a different worldview, that of the oppressed. That's good, it's a good thing to acknowledge, but you need to balance it with a critical politics to try to also free yourselves from oppression. And that is, I think, how she would be differentiated from her predecessors, at least in her own opinion. I'll point out an article by W.E.B. Du Bois of Our Spiritual Strivings, which he wrote 40 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, approximately, where he talks about the same thing, this double consciousness of being an American and being a black American, and how gifted with double sight, but at the same time torn apart by double and differing aims in life. So it's not unique. Uma Narayan's article, I would say, has a lot of the same points that Du Bois made. But the question is, how is she different than her predecessors? So she's saying, I would like to balance this account with a few comments about the dark side of the disadvantages of being able to or having to inhabit two mutually incompatible frameworks that provide differing perspectives on social reality. Okay, so she's just saying, not only as a feminist do I realize that women have this epistemic advantage, but all oppressed groups of people do. And she's trying to say, beware of this is an issue that having these two worldviews can pull you apart. It can empower you in some ways, disempower you in others. And she's just trying to acquaint people with the nuances of what comes with this epistemic advantage. It's also a disadvantage. So I'll just read a few excerpts. It's a relatively short excerpt from the greater essay that we have here. But so I'll just read a few sample selections here. Then I'll read a little bit of Du Bois, and then I think that'll be enough for this exam question. So I will start on page 94, the left-hand column, about halfway down. Feminist epistemology, like these other enterprises, that's the enterprises to preserve colonized cultures, must attempt to balance the assertion of the value of a different culture or experience against the dangers of romanticizing it to the extent that the limitations and oppressions it confers on its subjects are ignored. I think that one of the most interesting insights of feminist epistemology is the view that oppressed groups, whether women, the poor, or racial minorities, may derive an epistemic advantage from having knowledge of the practices of both their own contexts and those of their oppressors. The practices of the dominant group, for instance, men, govern a society. The dominated group, for instance, women, must acquire some fluency with those practices in order to survive in that society. There is no similar pressure on members of the dominant group to acquire knowledge of the practices of the dominated groups. And her example is language. The colonizers don't have to learn the language of the colonized peoples, but the colonized peoples do have to learn the language of their colonizers. The colonizers might learn the language of the oppressed people in a rudimentary fashion, just enough to enable them to more effectively oppress the people. This is what she's saying. And I think there's some validity to that. However, I think the oppressor mind also needs to be crafty and ingenious to maintain the oppression, especially if the oppressors are vastly outnumbered, and so that, would indicate the kind of the necessity. If you're going to be an oppressor, then you're also necessarily going to have to understand enough of the oppressed people to be able to oppress them, so it can get sick and twisted with psychological manipulations. At any rate, she makes a good point. Why do I need to learn the oppressed person's language? I don't need to ask them for a job. So, all right, so continuing here, she says, this advantage is thought to lead to critical insights because each framework provides a critical perspective of the other. I would like to balance this account with a few comments about the dark side, the disadvantages of being able to or having to inhabit two mutually incompatible frameworks that provide differing perspectives on social reality. And she talks about non-Western feminists, that it would be even harder for them because expressing the idea of I'm an independent woman in the Western countries isn't so controversial anymore, since feminism has more of a history. But in non-Western countries, it can lead to a lot of psychic fragmentation, problems with family, and she brings up some of these, and she mentions 3 different ways people can choose to deal with being forced to have these 2 worldviews, that of the oppressed and the oppressor. On the right-hand column, page 94, women may choose to live their public lives in a male mode, displaying characteristics of aggressiveness, competition, and so on, while continuing to play dependent and compliant roles in their private lives. So jumping back and forth between the public, I'll be a westernized, masculine type of woman so I can compete in the market. But back at home, I'm the traditional wife, dependent and compliant. And she's saying people who do that might claim that they're getting the best of both worlds. All right, second, the individual may try to reject the practices of her own context and try to be as much as possible like members of the dominant group. Or 3, lower down, or the individual could try to reject entirely the framework of the dominant group and assert the virtues of her own, despite the risks of being marginalized from the power structures of the society. Consider, for example, women who seek a certain sort of security in traditionally defined roles. Okay, I think women who find a certain security in traditionally defined roles would find that sentence to be offensive, but she's saying that's one of the 3rd way you can deal with being forced to have these 2 worldviews. Just one of them, skip back and forth in public, be like the oppressor's operate under the oppressor's worldview. The male, in this case, she's saying aggressive, competitive, and at home, adopt what your traditional society says women should be like. She's using women in this context, but it would apply for all oppressed peoples. Act like the oppressor when it's helpful to you, and act like adopt the rules of the oppressed peoples when that is helpful to you, and just balance them. The second one, reject the worldviews of the oppressed and embrace the worldview of the oppressor. And number 3 is the reverse of that, reject the worldview of the oppressor and embrace the worldview of the oppressed. So she says on page 95, left-hand column, the choice to inhabit 2 contexts critically is an alternative to these choices. So those were 3 choices, and she's saying inhabit the 2 contexts critically is a 4th choice, and I would argue a more useful one, by the presence of alternative contexts. But the presence of alternative contexts does not by itself guarantee that one of the other choices will not be made. Moreover, the decision to inhabit 2 contexts critically, although it may lead to an epistemic advantage, is likely to exact a certain price. It may lead to a sense of totally lacking roots or any space where one is at home in a relaxed manner. This sense of alienation may be minimized if the critical straddling of 2 contexts is part of an ongoing critical politics due to the support of others and a deeper understanding of what is going on. When it is not so rooted, it may generate ambivalence, uncertainty, despair, and even madness, rather than more positive critical emotions and attitudes. So she will go on to say, people who learn 2 different languages are seldom fluent in both. And similarly, the bottom of the left-hand column, page 95, the relation between the 2 contexts the individual inhabits may not be simple or straightforward. The individual subject is seldom in a position to carry out a perfect dialectical synthesis that preserves all the advantages of both contexts and transcends all their problems. So she was referring to Hegel's idea of dialectical synthesis. Hegel said history moves in like a zigzag fashion. There's this one position, which is a thesis, then a counterposition, which points out the flaws with the thesis, the antithesis, the antithesis. And then a third position unifies the best parts of both and rejects the flaws in both, and that's called the synthesis, the dialectical synthesis. And Uma Narayana is saying, when you're trying to synthesize 2 worldviews, the worldview of the oppressor and the worldview of the oppressed, we're going to see Friedrich Nietzsche later in the book describe this as master morality and slave morality. And he too says you should try to synthesize the 2 in each individual, but more often they're confusedly mixed. Uma Narayana is saying the same thing. You should try to inhabit both of these contexts critically and with the foreknowledge that it's going to be difficult. It's not going to be a nice, smooth synthesis. There's going to be a payoff for no matter what you do, it will come with a cost. But nevertheless, and her big warning is don't romanticize the role of the oppressed peoples so much that it enervates your political motivation to liberate yourself from oppression. I'll just read the last sentence. She says, the thesis that oppression may bestow an epistemic advantage should not tempt us in the direction of idealizing or romanticizing oppression and blind us to its real material and psychic deprivations. Okay, so I'm just going to point out here, because when I read this, I immediately thought of W.E.B. Du Bois. Actually, I'll read here on page 95, the right-hand column. Feminist theory must be temperate in the use it makes of this doctrine of double vision, the claim that oppressed groups have an epistemic advantage and access to greater critical conceptual space. So, double vision, be temperate. It's a good thing, it's a bad thing, and just be aware of that. And don't think, oh, the epistemic advantage of having the oppressed point of view outweighs the advantage of not being oppressed in the first place. So I think that's another thing she's adding here. But here is from W.E.B. Du Bois, Of Our Spiritual Strivings, and it's from his 1903 collection of essays, The Souls of Black Folk. And he said, oh, I grew up in Massachusetts, and everything was fine. I didn't know I was the only black kid in class until there was kind of a Valentine's Day card exchange. He handed his card to some new girl, And she's like, I don't want your card. And then he realized a veil dropped before him. He realized, oh, I'm black, I'm different. And then from then on, he held everybody in the pale world in contempt. And then he talks about the double vision, the second sight that black Americans have, being forced to see themselves through their own perspective and through the perspective of white people. It's just, it's the same basic idea that Uma Narayana was expressing in her article. And she even says, you know, this, what women have to deal with is dealt with by all oppressed peoples, and she specifically meant black people in the United States of America. So this is from Of Our Spiritual Strivings. Du Bois says, after the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Teuton and the Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of the other, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity, whenever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals, and one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. So that is, and then he goes on to say, and yet it is not weakness, it is the contradiction of double aims, the double-aimed struggle of the black artisan, on the one hand, to escape white contempt for a nation of mere hewers of wood and drawers of water, and on the other hand, to plow and nail and dig for a poverty-stricken horde, could only result in making him a poor craftsman, for he had but half a heart in either cause. That is a very good example of what Uma Narayana was talking about. The epistemic advantage of having double vision, seeing yourself from the oppressed and the oppressor's points of view, also has a disadvantage in that it can tear you apart and it can render you ineffectual in either world, that of the oppressor or the oppressed, and that you need to come at the issue critically, especially rooted in a political desire to liberate yourself from oppression, and don't worry about losing the epistemic advantage of being an oppressed person. You can maintain it by preserving the cultural gifts that either women in general or oppressed cultures have created, but at the same time, you know, yes, it's an advantage. It's also a disadvantage. That's her main point. That is what differentiates her. She's saying from, well, she's not saying it, but the question is, what is different about Narayan's position on knowledge from the views of her predecessors? Is her argument convincing? Why or why not explain? So I think the thing that she's saying is different is she just wants to warn people away from overly romanticizing the epistemic advantage of being a member of an oppressed group.